Hello, welcome to Recovery Demystified, a show where we explore our relationship to substances from a radical, non-religious, and empowering lens. Our sobriety is not a purity contract. It is an invitation to become curious about ourselves and find our own unique paths to growth and healing. If you've been questioning the role of alcohol or drugs in your life and haven't found the resources that you need, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hello, welcome back to Recovery Demystified. My name's Early. I'm so happy to have y'all here today. Happy to welcome y'all back to another episode of Recovery Resources, things you may have never heard of that actually help. And if these recovery resource episodes help you, then go ahead and share it with a friend who you think might need to hear this message, or hit that subscribe button, rate and review us. All that stuff is going to help us reach a larger audience of people that need to get these resources in their repertoire. Also, Recovery Demystified is a 501c3 nonprofit, so if you would be willing to donate to our cause, we have a link to donate in the description, and there's also a Patreon and a merch store in the description, so any of that stuff would be super helpful. And I stopped doing the book and podcast list for a minute because I literally could not find any more good podcasts and I got kind of burned out on it. And I do love reading, and I have still been consuming a lot of self-help and addiction literature, but I was also thinking about this really important skill I learned from the book Nonviolent Communication by Marshall B. Rosenberg. And I actually reviewed that book in Recovery Resources number 7 about a year ago. So go check that episode out if you're interested in learning about nonviolent communication. And anyway, the skill that I learned from that book was replacing the phrase "I have to" with "I choose to," because it is like a very empowering experience to realize that although we cannot control the causes and conditions of our environment, of the world that we live in, we can control our choices and our responses to those causes and conditions. So being neurodivergent, once I start to do something, once it's like in my routine, I sort of assume that I have to do it because I'm like, oh, well, I'm already doing that. So basically, I started doing the book and podcast list dry January of 2025. And then I did one in February, I did one in March. And then I was like, oh, I have to review 3 books and 3 podcasts every month forever. And that simply was just not true. It was just that I had previously made a habit of reviewing 3 books and 3 podcasts for a while. And I love reading, but I simply do not only want to read books on addiction and self-help, although I do really enjoy them and devour them and appreciate reading quite a large quantity of them. I also want to sometimes read like historical fiction or just, I don't know, something that is in another category. But anyway, the point is, I looked at that and I was like, why am I stressing myself out so much trying to cram in learning about all these podcasts when the sources are sort of starting to dry up, and trying to force myself to only read books about addiction and self-help? And then I was like, oh, I don't have to do this. I'm choosing to do this. And so I let that go for a little while, but I've finally read enough books and learned about enough new podcasts that I can put together another episode for you guys. And I've gotten some pretty great feedback that these are helpful, and I'm really happy to be like filtering through all of the bullshit and just bringing you guys the good stuff and the honest opinions, you know, from a anarchist, queer, punk, rock, fucking neurodivergent perspective, which is like, you know, I'm filtering it. But anyway, in my recovery personally, I did a lot of reading and a lot of listening and picking through and getting the different skills and assets from reading a lot of books that are like, you know, based in science, and then also listening to a lot of different kind of podcasts, people's personal experiences, and then also some that are more science-based, really helped me to take my addiction from feeling completely mysterious to literally demystifying it, which is where, you know, Recovery Demystified came from. And that shit saved my life. That self-education saved my fucking life. And it was really hard to find good books and podcasts in the beginning. So that's why I'm excited to be able to do that for y'all. And anyway, The first book that I want to talk about that I read recently is called The Deepest Well by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. And this book talks in depth about ACEs, which is an acronym that stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And ACEs is it's a simple list of 10 questions, but the 10 questions involve really fucked up shit that perhaps may or may not have happened in your childhood. So the ACEs questionnaire is available, just Googling it. It's all over the internet. But since it can be extremely triggering, I invite people to really only look over the ACEs questionnaire if you're doing it with your therapist or somewhere that you feel really calm and held, where you can take care of your emotions once you've realized where you sit on this list. Be with a loving friend or someone that can care for you, or just, make sure you're held before you look at that list, because digging up the fucked up shit that happened in our childhood can be quite the experience emotionally. But anyway, the book, The Deepest Well, goes into the study of adverse childhood experiences and how they manifest in our childhood and adult lives. And the interesting thing about ACEs and addiction is that, if I forget the exact statistic, but if you have an ACEs score of 4 or more, basically your risk of developing an addiction just goes up exponentially from there. ACEs are also interesting because they affect our chances of getting anxiety or depression or PTSD or physical issues, even heart disease and cancer and strokes, all increase when we have these adverse childhood experiences. And it's because the body switches to this state of chronic stress. And when our body's in this state of chronic stress, it just affects all of our body systems and our resiliency and our ability to just, be normal, healthy human beings in this world. So her scientific studies into that are extremely interesting. And for me, it really helps to understand what my ACEs score is, how that affects my chance of developing an addiction or health problems. And then that leads me to be able to make responsible decisions about my self-care based on that information, and also take some of that guilt off of myself for having become addicted, because it's literally just a change in my physiology and brain chemistry based on things I didn't have control over when I was a child. And that being said, ACEs scores don't mean you have you're not sentenced to have an addiction. It just increases your likelihood a lot to have an addiction, but it doesn't mean that there's not space for recovery. And I think becoming aware of those childhood experiences and how they affect our risk allows us to open up to this new idea that, at least according to Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, and also logic, I don't know, the solution to chronic stress in the body is engaging every single day in multiple ways to promote chronic relaxation. And she talks about all the different ways we can do that through nutrition and exercise and sleep, and just those basic human needs that we can take care of ourselves, and trauma therapy. And her book's also really interesting because she talks at length about epigenetics, which it's just really interesting to be able to learn about different things like that: epigenetics, chronic stress, adverse childhood experiences, and how they influence our chance of getting an addiction, and then how we can implement chronic relaxation in our lives to try to repair the harm that was done from those adverse childhood experiences. So I definitely highly recommend the book, The Deepest Well. And then the next books that I read recently were by Dr. Faith G. Harper. And I was trying to search for books on the internet, from AK Press or somewhere, that were going to have a radical anarchist perspective on addiction and recovery. And this was literally the only book that AK had on addiction. And I'm is anyone out there know about a book or books that are specifically from queer, anarchist, neurodivergent, radical perspectives? The best I've been able to find is Holly Whitaker's book, Quit Like a Woman. But even that one, has its moments. It's a bit gender essentialist. But then anyway, I got the books Unfuck Your Addiction and Unfuck Your Brain by Dr. Faith G. Harper, because I was these sound great just based on the reviews and the subtitle. So Unfuck Your Addiction, the subtitle is Using Science to Free Yourself from Harmful Reliance on Substances, Habits, and Out-of-Control Behaviors. And then Unfuck Your Brain, Using Science to Get Over Anxiety, Depression, Anger, Freakouts, and Triggers. And I was like, well, that sounds good, you know? And so these books landed with me just extra medium, but it's not because they're bad, it's just because they're tiny and simple, which is also maybe what some people need in early recovery, because you might pick up a huge 500-page book with like a bunch of scientific information in tiny print and a bunch of jargon that's hard to understand, and that might make recovery seem really unapproachable. So what's good about these books is they're small, they give you little introductory statements to a lot of different concepts, and then you can decide what interests you and sort of go to explore those concepts more. Also, I just found it to be sort of cringe that the entire book, she's like, I don't know, just like cussing and talking in this really immature way, which there's nothing wrong with that. And I guess I should have expected it when the title is called Unfuck Your Addiction. And I don't know, like maybe that style of writing resonates with people. And like, I don't think it's bad. Just for me, I was like, okay, this is like low-key sort of cringe how she talks. But I don't know. It's not up to me what is good and not good for other people. But if you need just like a small, easy to read, lighthearted book full of cussing that's going to give you a basic idea about where addictions come from, where anxiety and depression and things of that nature come from, and introductory statements and paragraphs that are really easy to digest about directions that you can take things, then that is when I think that these books are going to be really useful. So again, that would be Unfuck Your Addiction and Unfuck Your Brain by Dr. Faith G. Harper. And lastly, a book that I just finished is called Attached, The New Science of Adult Attachment and How It Can Help You Find and Keep Love by Amir Levine and Rachel Heller. And if y'all have been listening to me for a while, you know I am obsessed with attachment theory. And attachment theory is basically the idea that when our brains are forming in childhood, the amount of attunement that we got from our parents, caregivers, and other people in our life affected how our brain developed more or less for life. Like, this is a plastic concept. Like, there's always abilities for the brain to grow and change over time. But the basic idea is that if you got enough emotional love and attunement when you were a kid, you'll develop secure attachment. And then if you got inconsistent love and attention, you develop anxious attachment. And if you experienced profound emotional neglect, then you develop avoidant attachment. And then there's also a combination of anxious and avoidant attachment as well. And different authors have different names for that. Some people call it fearful avoidance. Some people call it disorganized attachment. But basically, if you've had like a rough time in relationships when you're an adult, if you have this deep fear of abandonment or deep fear of engulfment, then perhaps you have insecure attachment from when you were a kid. And apparently half of all people have secure attachment, but I've never met one. So if you have secure attachment, I don't know where y'all at. They're all just like being really normal and healthy in their houses and not in the addiction recovery world, apparently. But okay, so rewind a little bit. When I was in AA, one of the extremely frustrating things that really pushed me away from that experience was they tell everyone you're not allowed to date for 1 calendar year after you get sober. And I'm like, okay, that's the most made up amount of time, and no one is just going to somehow magically be healed and ready for relationships in 1 year. Like, it's just so arbitrary. And also, when I was in early recovery, when I first got into long-term sobriety, I started dating someone who was my partner for 5 years, and it was an extremely healing relationship and validating and loving. And I can't imagine like meeting that person and being like, no, I'm in early recovery, so I'm not going to date you for 1 year. Like, it just doesn't make any fucking sense to me. So what I invite people to try to do instead is, in recovery, if you've noticed a pattern looking back in your life of having difficult or unhealthy relationships, then perhaps that is something you need to address if you want. And however long it takes you to address that is however long it takes you to address that. And there's no reason to deny yourself dating and love if it's available to you and you want it. But for me, learning about attachment theory has just been like instrumental in helping me understand myself. So I have anxious attachment, which means I have like this deep-seated fear of abandonment, and it feels like life or death. And learning about attachment theory has helped me understand that this is not a me problem. It's like a childhood development problem. And it's something that I can like learn how to heal with time. And reading this book was also super helpful because it illustrates why the feeling of chemistry between people when they're like romantic. For some people with insecure attachment, that feeling of chemistry is actually the body's like fear response, but we associate that fear and anxiety with, and that like emotional roller coaster with experiencing love because it is normal to us. And this book explains that really well. It also helped me understand avoidant people more because as an anxious person, I'm tend to be magnetically drawn to avoidant people, which then creates a self-fulfilling prophecy for both of us, because if I act anxious, then the avoidant person is like, oh, my fear of engulfment is triggered, and this just proves that I need to be afraid of being engulfed, and then they back off. And then me as an anxious person is like, oh, this person's backing off. My fear of abandonment is being validated. It's twisted. But anyway, reading books about attachment theory has really helped me be able to understand myself better and learn how to recognize my insecure thoughts and feelings when they're happening, and then learn how to respond to those in a healthy way, and also how to choose partners that can meet my needs instead of trying to date people that just can't do that. The criticisms I've had of this book are just that it is like so straight. Like all of the examples that they use of couples in the book are straight people. And then also they're just always saying like he or she and he or she. And it's like, oh my God, not everyone is a fucking he or she. Like, I don't know. Just have some fucking awareness that queer people exist. If you're straight and writing a book, just give it some fucking thought. So that shit is annoying about this book. You're just like, oh my God, stop talking about straight people. But anyway, there's still good information in this book about learning about attachment issues and how to heal them. And it's a quick read. It's very approachably written, which I also appreciate. Like, I do love scientific information, but I really appreciate when authors are able to convey that information in a way that is accessible so people of all reading levels can comprehend it. So it's a quick read for that reason, and that is why I suggest the book Attached by Amir Levine and Rachel Heller. And then there's a few podcasts that I actually thought were pretty good that I've found recently. And one is the Addicted Mind podcast. And this one I was actually on April 9th. If I'll link my episode in the show notes, and maybe I'll actually repost it on here so y'all can listen to it over on this side. And a lot of new listeners actually found me from my Addicted Mind interview. So hello, new listeners from the Addicted Mind. Happy to have you here. And the Addicted Mind is great. They have two different formats, kind of like I do, where some of the episodes are interviews and then other ones are just like tips and tricks. And the sound quality is really great. The host, Dwayne Osterland, is like really empathetic and sweet. And the interviews are mostly with like professionals in the field or like authors or whatever. So if you're interested in that, those are available to you. Obviously, I prefer to just interview normal people in recovery. A couple of times I've had professionals, but I like to destigmatize our experience as queer and neurodivergent people and those that are, you know, in our tribe. But anyway, yeah, the Addicted Mind, their tips and tricks episodes are really helpful. They just like lay out very clearly why you might be having a certain mental struggle. And then they're like, here is like a useful tool that you can actually employ today in response to that mental struggle. And it's really good for that. My only criticism of it is sort of dry. Like, Dwayne Osterland is some kind of a therapist or something. He's got some letters after his name, but him and his co-host are both, it just sounds kind of dry, like a little bit clinical, which I don't always love, but I mean, that perspective is needed too, but in my mind, the podcast host's like personality has to be like quite engaging for me to want to continue to listen. But with the addicted mind, it's like, okay, maybe the hosts aren't like massively engaging, but the critical information is there. So I keep tuning in for that reason. The content is very good. So that's why I recommend the podcast, The Addicted Mind. And then a new one I found recently is called Queering Harm Reduction. And they are just like a few episodes in. I think they have less than 20 episodes. But I was really excited to find it because I was like, oh my God, yes, more gay people like talking about addiction and recovery and the history of the war on drugs. And they just like put out a whole episode on like the meaning of the word sapphic and how that's changed. And they're talking about harm reduction. And yeah, it's just, I was very excited to be like, oh, thank God I'm not the only one out here doing this. And I'm sure that there's more than that. And I just like have to keep, spelunking to be able to find it. But I emailed them and we're going to try to do a little cross-pollination episode where we talk on each other's podcasts. But their show, Queering Harm Reduction, is really good. And yeah, I mean, I'm just glad other people are out there doing the work. So definitely I would head over to Queering Harm Reduction and check out that podcast. And then the last podcast I'm going to recommend is one called On the Grind. Host is Pepe Bandit. And he actually contacted me via Instagram after Joey's episode came out. So On the Grind, it's kind of hard to explain like what category it fits into, but it gets categorized apparently as like a music podcast. And the theme there is folk punk, which y'all punks in general have a pretty high rate of severe substance use disorders and addiction and alcohol use disorders. So although I've never really totally been in the folk punk community, it makes sense that the same issues with punks are happening in that subculture as well as, I was more kind of a crust punk. I think I'm a punk for life, but, I sort of just keep to myself in my cabin in the woods now. I'm not really doing as much punk shit anymore. Not that we really have very much of that in Northwest Arkansas. But anyway, yeah, so On the Grind is interesting because it tackles like a whole different range of subjects. Like it's sort of uncategorizable other than, I guess, the folk punk nature of the guests sort of like threads and weaves everything together. But they do have episodes specifically about addiction. And then they have episodes where addiction is like a theme. And then they'll also talk about just different like self-helpy kind of stuff with folks or like anarchism in the folk punk scene. And it's just, yeah, I mean, that guy, Pepe, I'm excited because we're also going to do like a little cross-pollination at some point. His story is really interesting. He never struggled with like a substance use disorder, but he was in prison for several years for trafficking weed, like large amounts of weed. So I'm excited to have him on the pod and tell y'all his story. And then I'm going to go on there and talk about, helpful tools for addiction and recovery and answer some listener questions. But I was excited to find his podcast because also I'm like, why is it so hard to just search for like punks or queers or neurodivergent people talking about addiction or other interesting topics? Like, I don't know. I literally feel like I'm spelunking, like I'm in a dark cave of podcasts and I don't know the right keywords to tell podcast land to give me what I need. But whenever I find something that's actually good, I'm like, oh my God, like bells are ringing, angels are singing. But yeah, On the Grind is pretty good. And it's got some relatable topics that if you enjoy my podcast, that perhaps you also might enjoy his podcast. And yeah, that's 3 books, 3 podcasts that should get you a good direction to go on finding some recovery resources that are helpful for you. And, and I'll be reading and I'll be listening and I'm just constantly picking through all this stuff, trying to find things that I think are helpful for healing in our addiction and our recovery. So if you appreciate this work and this stuff is helpful for you, then go ahead and recommend this podcast to a friend who you think might need to hear this message. And if you don't mind hitting that subscribe button or rating us 5 stars and leaving a review would be super helpful. And of course, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. So if you want to support our mission monetarily, there is a link to donate in the description. And there is also a Patreon if you would like to join that. And yeah, if you're struggling today, I think you are doing a great job. And listening to a podcast about recovery, I think, is a fucking great thing to do. So I'm super proud of you. And I know that you can do this. And yeah, you got this. If you're struggling today, I see you and I believe in you. And I know you got this. So nice to talk to y'all. I'll be back next week. May you be happy and free. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Recovery Demystified. If you like what you heard, share it with a friend or rate and review us so we can reach a larger audience. Recovery Demystified is produced and edited by me, Early Brunner. Stevie Pettit made our logo. Our beautiful theme music is by Logan Bragg. And our social media manager is Kaylee Bausch. We are entirely supported by your generous donations as a 501c3 nonprofit. You can find a link to donate in the description. May you be happy and free, dear listener.